thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am so honored to introduce our speaker, and I just want to introduce ourselves and why we're presenting this webinar this evening. The Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation is a nonprofit that operates the El Presidio de Santa Barbara State Historic Park, Casa de la Guerra. The mission of the trust is to steward the past and the present of the Presidio neighborhood and inspire preservation advocacy throughout the county in order to create a more vibrant community. We have a vibrant community logging on here. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kevin McGarry. I'm the Associate Director for Public Engagement. I've been with the Trust for about 6 years, and I'm really excited about tonight's talk. It's an important subject, talking about Native American diet and foodways throughout early California. Before we begin tonight's event, I'd like to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our region. Let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and the strength of all indigenous people that have and the strength they've shown worldwide. We are on the traditional territory here in Santa Barbara of the Chumash peoples. If you'd like to, in the chat, you can let us know where you are and what indigenous peoples territory you are located upon. I have a couple of housekeeping details. Our presentation this evening is closed captioned for the hearing impaired. You can find the control to turn on or off the subtitles in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. It is a CC icon that you can click on to drop. It's a drop-down menu with options. If you do not see the CC icon, click on More, which means that your Zoom screen is smaller than your full screen usually, and you should be able to see the option there to turn on or off the CC icon. This presentation will be recorded and it will be made available at a later date on our website, which I'll share later, and our YouTube channel. So that is the housekeeping details. And the most exciting part is to introduce Sarah Noe, who is a PhD student in anthropology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Sarah's love for archaeology began at the age of 15 when she participated in a public archaeological excavation of a Native American village. She's a zoo archaeologist, a term that I just learned, which is amazing, and specializes in the examination of animal bones. Her current research focuses around diet and meals, examining how communities respond to the shifting and social and environmental conditions, and how food is intricately connected to one's cultural identity. And she's going to share with us her dissertation research this evening. And I'd like to hand it off to Sarah. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that introduction. All right, start sharing. All right, so today I'm going to be talking with you about my research at Mission Santa Clara, my presentation entitled Foodways and Persistence, Examination of Native American Diet at Mission Santa Clara. So the research I'm presenting today is based off of work conducted at Mission Santa Clara, located within the homeland of the Tamian Ohlone, examining material culture belonging to the Ohlone, Yokut speakers, and Miwok peoples. And this project was completed at UC Santa Barbara, located within the homeland of the Barbareño Chumash. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this research affects both the lands and the people, past, present, and future. This research I'm about to present on cannot directly speak for the lived experiences and impacts created by the Spanish mission system. Instead, this project sheds light on the daily diet of the Ohlone, Yokut, and Miwok peoples who reside within Mission Santa Clara, providing information that was ignored and never recorded by the Spanish colonizers. So I'm going to first start off with a brief history of the Spanish mission system, just so everybody's on the same page. Following the founding of the first Spanish colonial town of St. Augustine in Florida in 1565, see it here on the map, the top right-hand corner, the Spanish expanded westward with a new mission system established along the ever-expanding frontier. This imperial expansion has been described as simultaneously an invasion, a colonization effort, a social experiment, a religious crusade, and a highly structured economic enterprise. Alta California was the final frontier of the Spanish colonial expansion in North America, developing northward from missions established in Baja California. The mission period began in Alta California in 1697, with Spanish Jesuits and later Franciscans rapidly expanding northward, founding 21 missions that dotted the coast from modern-day San Diego up through San Francisco. The purpose for establishing the mission system in Alta California was threefold. First, the Spanish crown aimed to colonize Alta California to halt the colonial expansions of both Russians and the English. Second, differing from other aspirations of other European powers vying for control of North America, Spain sought to incorporate local populations within its new society. The policy of reducción ordered Spanish soldiers and Franciscan padres to relocate native Californians from differing ethno-linguistic groups into single centralized missions with the intention to transform the native populations into Christian Spanish citizens loyal to the crown. Third, each mission was designed to be semi-autonomous and self-sufficient through the creation of agricultural fields focused on European-style farming. The Spanish colonial enterprise in California was comprised of mission complexes, presidios or military outposts, and pueblos, towns for the Spanish citizens. Originally, the mission system in Alta California supported and relied on the Kingdom of New Spain. The Mexican War of Independence in the early 19th century halted communication and support. To compensate, Alta California missions began to trade surplus goods with the British and Russian colonies. In 1821, Mexico successfully ceded from Spain and acquired the expansive Alta California colonial system, initiating what scholars refer to as the Mexican years. The transition of power is sometimes often overlooked. The transition of control from Spain to Mexico ultimately converted these mission institutions from social to economic organizations. However, everyday life within the mission complexes seemingly changed very little. Eventually, the continued commercial success of the missions brought them under scrutiny from the growing Mexican civilian population in California, who coveted the fertile land. In 1833, Mexico passed a law of secularization, thus privatizing all 21 mission settlements, permanently ending the Alta California mission system. The secularization of the missions from 1834 to 1836 proceeded somewhat haphazardly. Military settlers and migrants from Mexico received preferential land allotments, despite original promises of equal distribution between the colonists and native Californians. Mission Santa Clara de Asis was established in the southern portion of modern-day San Francisco Bay in January of 1777. Reoccurring flooding and earthquakes necessitated the relocation of the mission and quadrangle, eventually creating 5 iterations of the mission complex. Resultingly, Mission Santa Clara has accordingly been denoted the movable mission. The first, third, and fifth mission complexes were permanent, with the second and fourth temporary, used only as the permanent complexes were being constructed. Mission Santa Clara was considered one of the largest and richest missions within Alta California, with fertile soils, numerous buildings, and expansive areas for cultivation. Accounts from explorers who frequently visited the mission regularly stated that Mission Santa Clara boasted some of the best soils, allowing for greater yields than neighboring missions. Reports from the early 1800s state that due to the increasing size of cattle herds, the practice of culling was instituted to minimize overgrazing. As the 8th mission established within Alta California, Mission Santa Clara was the first mission built within the homeland of the Tamiana Ohlone. Today, the term Ohlone actually refers to a number of native groups of the north central coast of California who simply spoke similar languages. The mission era deposits discussed in this presentation were unearthed from excavations in the Rancheria, the primary housing location of married indigenous families who lived at Mission Santa Clara. Young girls and unmarried women were housed in dormitories located within the mission quadrangle, while young boys and unmarried men were housed elsewhere within the mission boundaries. Despite consistent reconstructions of the main mission quadrangle and the many iterations of the mission shown in the image up on the left, the Rancheria did not move throughout the mission's existence. The Rancheria was comprised of a combination of adobe row houses and circular native style structures, pictures of which I'll be showing in a couple slides. Ethnographic reports describe the adobe houses as encircling a large open rectangular space where communal furnaces and cauldrons were used to cook food eaten within this area. Dissimilar to Spanish missions established elsewhere in the Americas, The policy of reduction recruited Native Californians from a multitude of different ethno-linguistic groups into these single centralized missions. In the early years, Mission Santa Clara housed primarily Ohlone people from a multitude of adjacent villages speaking various linguistic dialects. In 1811, people from groups who spoke the Yukut language in the San Joaquin Valley were gradually incorporated into the mission. After resistance in 1828 to 1829, where Native Californians revolted against Mexicans in the San Joaquin Valley, Miwok peoples were brought into the mission in smaller numbers until secularization in 1836. The pluralistic indigenous population at Mission Santa Clara is not unique in Alta California, as many missions house peoples from numerous cultural and linguistic groups. Mission Santa Clara is best understood as housing a continuous but shifting mix of indigenous Californians from a territory encompassing land spanning modern-day San Francisco Bay to the San Joaquin Valley. There is extensive ethnographic documentation from the mission period, providing us with some baseline information concerning the movement of people into the mission. However, determining which ethno-linguistic group an archaeological artifact is affiliated with is difficult and often impossible. This presentation, therefore, refers to those who reside within Mission Santa Clara as Native Californians, but the incredible diversity of people with different cultural traditions and different languages spoken must be acknowledged and recognized. California missions developed a massive agricultural and animal husbandry system designed to provide food and other resources to the presidios and ranchos and to export secondary animal products back to Spain. Vast fields of corn, wheat, and barley, gardens of vegetables, vineyards of grapes, and orchards containing a great variety of fruits were planted and harvested. Additionally, large herds of cattle, sheep, and goats, occasionally pigs, and domestic fowl were raised for food, hide, tallow, and wood. At all of the missions, cattle and sheep were the dominant species. Their prevalence was primarily due to the value of their byproducts, specifically hide and tallow acquired from cows. As at other Alta California missions, at Mission Santa Clara, men from the Ohlone, Northern Valley Yokuts, and people from the interior Miwok groups were all incorporated into an agrarian labor force. Although the productivity of Mission Santa Clara's agricultural fields was solely attributable to the indigenous men, it is the Franciscan padres who controlled the harvests and allocated rations for daily meals. So, as Kevin said at the very beginning of this presentation, I'm a zooarchaeologist. So zooarchaeology studies animal bones recovered from archaeological sites. This includes bones, shell, horn, and very rarely, but occasionally, fur and hide. Zooarchaeology and the study of fauna remains is different than what most people typically think about when they think of archaeology. Typically, the word archaeology evokes images of intricate ceramic pieces, beautiful temples and monument ruins, projectile points and arrowheads. Rarely do people think of partially intact animal bones. However, food is more than solely measured calories and nutrients. Eating is not merely an act required for survival, devoid of any social meaning. Instead, it's both a personal and group activity, intricately tied to the formation and maintenance of both personal and group identities. Think about daily family dinners and Thanksgiving feast. Think about some of the first words that come to mind when I say Ireland or Italy. Food is inherently social phenomenon, with foodways often a defining characteristic of social identity. Within studies of colonialism and colonial spaces, the study of food through the examination of fauna remains, as depicted in the pictures above, has challenged past assumptions of assimilation and acculturation. Understanding how foodway activities are altered and how they persist is an integral component in understanding the impact of colonialism and how people and their cultures continue to survive. So for the excavation, in the late 19th century, the Society of Jesuits established Santa Clara College, which was a precursor to Santa Clara University. They established this within the historic boundaries of Mission Santa Clara. As the university has expanded over the last century, the construction projects have fueled the exposure and excavation of numerous intact features that exist across campus. The long history of archaeological work conducted at Mission Santa Clara provides essential foundational knowledge concerning the layout of many of the mission buildings. So this presentation focuses on fauna remains recovered from a multi-year excavation project named Franklin Block 448. As shown in the figure in the middle and on the left-hand side, the excavation is situated on the site of the Third Mission Church and associated quadrangle and the Rancheria. Through this excavation, portions of the adobe row houses were exposed and aligned with historical records that documented the layout of the rancheria. In addition to the adobe row houses, native style pit houses, shown in the image at the top middle, were also unearthed, suggesting that Native Californians lived in their traditional dwellings as well as the adobe buildings. From the many features identified within Franklin Block 448 project, seen in the leftmost image, communal refuse pits or communal trash pits, designated feature 196, 176, and 194 were chosen for this study. These three communal refuse or trash features were located within the rancheria and associated with the adobe housing complex, indicating that the fauna remains identified represent foodway and consumption activities related to the daily diet of Native Californians that lived within Mission Santa Clara. Based on associated artifacts excavated and ethnographic material, a clear chronological sequence of these features was generated. So feature 196 contains material from the 1780s to the early 1800s, feature 176 from 1800s to the 1820s, and then feature 194 from the early 1820s to 1836 for secularization when the mission period ended. Importantly, the three features together span the entire mission period, allowing for an examination of diet from the founding of the mission through to secularization. As said earlier, feature 196, the earliest feature, is most likely only associated with Ohlone families who live within the rancheria. And feature 176 is most likely only associated with Ohlone and Yokut families. However, these distinctions cannot be definitively made. Therefore, this analysis broadly focuses on Native American diet. So the faunal assemblage from these three contexts in Mission Santa Clara is considerable and included upwards of 27,000 specimens. From the identification of these animal bones, an image emerged of Native American diet that included a broad array of animals. From the wild animals, included deer, California ground squirrel, a number of birds, mainly waterfowl, and aquatic resources, including fish and shellfish. Additionally, European domesticates of cow, sheep, goat, and chicken were also identified. And it is on these colonial foods that I will first start. So following the counting and the weighing and the identifying of each bone, a number of calculations were made. First one is biomass, which is an estimate of the amount of meat associated with a given quantity or weight of bone. So previously, these allometric equations were calculated for identifying the relationship between the weight of shell and bone and how much meat is associated with that bone. And all of these calculations were made for birds, shellfish, reptiles, every class of animal. So using these, I calculated how much meat is coming from each animal. So this bar chart represents the meat eaten, with orange designated as cow and the sliver of yellow, all the other animals identified. Each bar is from a feature relating to the time period at the mission. So the first bar is feature 196, 1780s to the 1800s, feature 176, 1800s to 1820, feature 194, 1820s to 1836. Based on the estimate of biomass or meat eaten, domestic mammals, specifically cow, dominate. This indicates the daily diet of Native Californians at Mission Santa Clara focused on cattle, and the biomass or the meat eaten stays largely consistent throughout the mission occupation. Taking a closer look, I next examine which cuts of meat or parts of the cow were primarily eaten. So the skeleton was divided into 8 groupings: the head, forequarter, hindquarter, forefoot, hindfoot, foot, tail, vertebra, rib. So each color of this bar represents a feature with each time period. So simply based off this, ribs and vertebra category are the most numerous, relating to the area outlined in green on the image of the cow skeleton. This indicates that these portions of the cow were primarily consistently eaten throughout the mission period. The body portions yielding the most meat, the hindquarter, flank, the forequarter, are underrepresented in comparison. The diet of those living within Alta California missions is markedly different than other Spanish missions established in North and Central America. Rather than traditional Spanish dishes, meals eaten were instead an amalgamation of Iberian, Mesoamerica, and African dishes developed from prolonged years of contact and marriage. The morning and evening meals of atole were grain soups, while lunch, a thick broth stew or stew pozole, was made with vegetables and meat. Written records report that the Spanish soldiers, Franciscan Padres, and native Californians all ate varying versions of these dishes every single day. The key to pozole, the main meal of the day, were the cuts of meat included with the stew. As I previously stated, the Alta California mission system settlements were economic endeavors with the goal of being self-sufficient. At the height of the mission period, many missions in California contained upwards of 100,000 heads of cattle, and the majority of these cattle were raised for their hide and tallow. Hides were put to a wide variety of uses, including mattresses, horse blankets, saddles, shoes, knapsacks, door covering, rope. Tallow, which is the fat of the steer, was used for cooking, to make candles, to make soap. While some of the cattle were, of course, killed for their meat, much of the meat has been documented to actually have been left to waste because killing cattle for tallow and hide was much more profitable. This is key for understanding daily meals, key in understanding these butchering patterns. As has been documented archaeologically and ethnographically before this study, ribs attached with vertebra are difficult to strip the meat from, unlike smoother long bones such as the femur. Therefore, ribs and vertebra were transported back to the mission to be used in stews, in the daily stews of atole and pozole, rather than discarded at the butchery site. So at this point in the analysis, the daily diet of native Californians living within Mission Santa Clara seemed pretty straightforward and consistent. It's primarily comprised of eating colonial-style dishes, cow meat. However, when I first received the boxes of bones containing these faunal remains, I was frankly dismayed at how fragmented the collection was. Broken bones cannot be identified to species or taxon. They can really only be counted and thus are somewhat useless in analysis. Of the 27,000 bones analyzed for this project, roughly 20,000 of them were unidentifiable bone fragments, as shown in the top right-hand picture. Upon closer inspection, however, I completed a number of standard analyses to determine whether taphonomic processes such as acidic soils, weathering, carnivore gnawing, trampling, compaction were responsible for the fragmentation of the assemblage, which I could go into more detail later if anyone's really interested. I actually discovered that the bones were in fact fragmented, not from taphonomy, but through purposeful human intention. The bones were broken by whoever was cooking these meals. Patterns of bone breakage shed light on the intensity of mammalian bone utilization. This spectrum includes cut marks, indicative of butchering and chopping activities to acquire appropriate sizes for cooking and consumption, especially when you have to fit the bones into a pot for stewing. This is clearly seen in the bottom left-hand corner, where vertebral and rib elements display evidence of cut marks. Then there's the extraction of marrow, indicated by a single break, specifically a spiral fracturing, shown in the top right-hand corner. And then finally, there's the intense pulverization of bones, which really only occurs when these fragments are pulverized and boiled to extract grease. And this is depicted in the picture in the top left-hand corner. So in addition to meat, mammalian bones specifically are a source for both bone marrow and bone grease, two reliable sources for essential fatty acids. Bone marrow is the single most concentrated fat source and is relatively easy to obtain, requiring just a single break to access the marrow within the bone. Bone grease is a fat reserve stored within the cancellous portion of the bone and is far less accessible. Bone must first be pulverized, the bone fragments are boiled, the mixture cooled, and then the fat skimmed off the surface in liquid. Marrow extraction requires less time and labor while providing more calories for less energy spent. Marrow and grease extraction are very uncommon food processing activities for domestic livestock. Grease and marrow exploitation is commonly only seen as a strategy used to combat malnutrition, justifying the additional time and labor required. For example, I previously worked in Iceland, examining Viking diet during severe environmental droughts. This was at a time when Vikings had adopted European-style cooking and husbandry activities, so they were reliant on sheep, cow, and goat. I found evidence for the extraction of marrow and grease from only Viking settlements that were attempting to combat food insecurity brought on by the drought. So it can be very difficult, though, archaeologically, to determine if a population is starving. However, from this study, what we do know is that Mission Santa Clara is one of the richest, most productive missions in Alta, California. Multiple reports state that culling was enacted to minimize the cattle herds, and accounts from explorers and various visitors throughout the mission period explicitly state that cattle were primarily killed for their tallow and hide, and the meat was just left out to rot. There was enough meat to feed everybody, but of course, we cannot solely rely on the benevolence of the colonizers. Native Californians who lived within the mission complex had practiced hunting and gathering activities in this region for millennia before the arrival of the Spanish. While the procurement of traditional wild food resources was undoubtedly limited, as I'll be discussing next, it is very unlikely that if faced with severe starvation and or malnutrition, the Native Californians would be unable to procure wild food resources. While the extraction of marrow and grease are uncommon practices for domesticated animals, these practices were very common and widespread amongst all Native Californians, the majority of the Native Californians before the arrival of the Spanish. Deer and elk are the only large mammal in Alta California, and a diet that was primarily reliant on wild plants, nuts, and seafood, pulverizing mammalian bones to acquire essential nutrients that were often difficult to otherwise get in your daily meals. It's a very common and a very well-documented activity. Numerous ethnographic and archaeological research has demonstrated that deer and elk bones were routinely broken to extract grease and marrow. Therefore, rather than an indicator of dietary stress or malnutrition, this analysis indicates that throughout the mission period, Native Californians fractured mammalian bones to extract marrow and grease to enrich a broth while cooking cattle meat within their Spanish-style stews. Native Californians prepared and cooked the Spanish-style stews using these traditional processing techniques and passed knowledge of how to prepare and consume large mammals. It's important at this point to notice that the utilization acceptance of a foreign culinary activity within circumstances of coercion, pressure, or mere practicability does not correlate with this pervasive idea that Native Californians have lost their cultures and identity. The context of food preparation and consumption are often more significant than the food itself. Identity is fluid and negotiated, and changes in practices do not equate to social and cultural cleavage. Instead, this analysis of food remains represents distinct evidence for persistence, for the persistence of Native California foodway practices throughout the mission period, continuing undoubtedly even after the mission period ended. As stated earlier in this presentation, cattle, of course, was not the only animals consumed. Native Californians of the San Francisco Bay had access to three broad environmental zones: estuarine and tidal marshlands, grassland prairies, and oak woodlands. Along the shores of the bay, Native Californian groups constructed monumental shell mounds and raised villages out of the high tide zone using waste from tons of consumed shellfish. They used tule reed boats to fish and hunt shorebirds, and fire to enhance the productivity of grasslands. Oak woodlands provided enough acorns to sustain many communities, and waterways provided marine and freshwater resources. Rounding out their diverse diet were grasses, sea otters, and of course deer. Early accounts of Europeans to Mission Santa Clara in the early 1700s or late 1700s detail expansive oak trees encompassing the valley and an abundance of wildlife residing within these groves. In the decades following the establishment of the mission, written records specify the rapid destruction of the local environment following the introduction of intensive agriculture and the deforestation of the groves for timber. While smaller groves of trees were left standing, much of the forest and the local grasslands were replaced by European plants, both domestic and wild. As cattle herds thrived in the semi-arid climate of Santa Clara Valley, the intensive plowing and planting destroyed native vegetation, unused to the pressures of toothed animals. Inadvertently accompanying these foreign crops, European weaves thrived in these new ecosystems. Stemming from the Spanish colonial complexes, the spread of foreign weeds that had accompanied agricultural seeds brought in the destruction of native vegetation well beyond the borders of the mission complexes themselves. Invasive non-native weeds adapted effectively to these new environments, expanding from the central locations to the more remote areas in California, otherwise untouched by the Spanish. The alteration of Alta California was furthered by the Spanish outlawing of traditional land management practices, specifically controlled burning, which vitally cleared and maintained native landscapes. The expansive grasslands, which additionally were often utilized as fields for livestock, were particularly affected by these lack of controlled burnings. While the timing and alteration of the native vegetation ecosystems, particularly the remote areas outside the mission complexes, remains uncertain, by the end of the mission period, much of the oak groves and the grasslands have been irrevocably damaged. As a result, Native Californians, both residing within their traditional villages and the mission complexes, were required to travel to increasingly distant locations to obtain wild plants and animals that have been plentiful in the preceding decades. Despite these severe social and environmental constraints, Spanish foods were not the only foods consumed. Wild food resources were continually acquired and consumed throughout the mission period. So to assess these hunting strategies, first, all of these wild resources were divided into 4 categories. First, tracked long distance, which essentially is only deer and elk. Aquatic, which includes shellfish, fish, small mammals such as California ground squirrels and rabbits, and then flying, any matter of birds. So in this line graph on the right, each line represents one of the animal groupings I just specified. So we have yellow for aquatic resources and dark red for small trapped animals. And the features and the time periods are at the bottom of the graph. So based on the proportions of simple count of this line graph, both the animals captured from long distance foray, shown the yellow at the bottom, and aquatic food resources requiring forays outside of the mission complex decrease through time. Small mammals that are easily trapped, shown in dark red, and birds shown in orange, which were able to be hunted within the mission boundaries, increase through time. Disturbance or edge species animals that thrive in areas plowed and planted. These often include small and medium mammals. As such, these fauna are typically hunted within gardens and agricultural fields. This subsistence strategy, termed garden hunting, prevents the destruction of crops by pests while negating the need for long-distance foraging trips. As Spanish colonial sites and settlements came to occupy large swaths of land in Alta, California, colonial land use practices of agriculture and animal husbandry had the immediate adverse effect of native vegetation. These ecological transformations undoubtedly impeded the continuation of traditional hunting practices outside of the mission, as expeditions would have required traveling to further locations beyond the mission borders. Instead, this faunal assemblage displays evidence for a shift toward garden hunting, evidenced by the increase in small mammals, specifically California ground squirrels and rabbits. Trapping requires continued maintenance of traps, suggesting the continued deliberate effort in this hunting strategy. This shift in hunting strategies represents the maintenance and reconfiguration of hunting activity as a whole, as practices were simply modified and adapted to exist within the shifting boundaries of this colonial system. Shift toward garden hunting is also seen with birds. Birds in particular had, of course, symbolic and ritual importance rather than just caloric value. Smaller songbirds such as robins and scrubjoys, as well as barn owls and hawks in particular, were hunted or acquired after their natural death for medicinal purposes and their plumage for regalia. Waterfowl, ducks and geese in particular, however, were important food resources. Similar to the previous line graph, the colored lines correspond to groupings. The bright red line at the very bottom of both graphs are ocean birds, such as cormorants, followed by the dark red line, which includes diving ducks or ocean ducks. Both groupings had very few specimens throughout the mission period. The orange line are species of geese, and the yellow line, dabbling ducks, such as mallards. Notably, through time, measures of count and meat of dabbling ducks decreases, while geese sharply increases. For geese, from middens 196 and 176, the 2 features that are dating to the early mission years, most of the remains are from the wing portion, highlighted in yellow on the picture on the left, while there are very few bones from the pectoral region, highlighted in blue. This aligns with the transport costs of geese, as the average weight of Canadian goose is between 8 to 10 pounds, prompting the meat to be cut from the breastbone, leaving no faunal evidence, as hunters only return with the wing. However, in the final midden, 194, dating to the end of the mission years, geese elements from the entire carcass are present, indicating closer hunting strategies, allowing for the transportation of the entire bird to the rancheria. Geese are an adaptable species, able to thrive within disturbance areas, specifically agricultural fields. These changes in waterfowl and geese remains suggest a shift in garden hunting. This aligns with the previous evidence for the shift toward garden hunting. Although dabbling ducks were also able to survive in many different areas, with many of the freshwater areas and adjacent to the mission either drying up or being filled in due to construction, dabbling ducks became increasingly difficult to hunt, while geese were hunted within the mission boundaries. It's a vast understatement to say that the mission period was a great time of change for California's Indigenous people. The continual modification of cultural practices and social identities documented for many colonial settings, including the California mission system, might better be thought of as a process of persistence. Persistence in this sense describes the intentional rearticulation of certain practices and related identities in light of new economic, political, and social realities, My goal with this project was to use the archaeological analysis of material remains from the colonial era deposits to highlight how Native people built upon existing cultural knowledge within the constraints of missionization, effectively linking the past and present in a dynamic but unbroken trajectory. Regardless of the location of the hunting activities and the main component of daily meals, this final analysis both reaffirms and challenges the limiting nature of the mission system. The mission period undoubtedly altered and transformed the daily life and subsistence strategies of Native Californians. Nevertheless, this analysis suggests that Native Californian diet within the mission system, and more broadly, Native Californian lifeways and traditions persisted throughout the mission period. Of course, these findings must be tempered by the tragic demographic and ecological realities of the mission period, but they nevertheless point towards a different narrative about Indigenous life in colonial California. The archaeology of sites like Mission Santa Clara help us to move beyond the myths of extinction and acculturation that have plagued the Native people of Central California by providing a much needed window into how Native Californians persisted long after the mission period ended. And I would like to thank the Critical Mission Foundation who helped fund this project, as well as a number of zooarchaeologists and my advisor who assisted in the identification of the many, many bone fragments. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Sarah. Wow, what a wealth of information. We have a question. And anyone that has questions in the audience, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The first question is from Linda. Have you found any horse, mule, or donkey remains?
So Linda, nice to see you. As Linda knows, I'm progressing with this project a little bit further. I have upwards of 20 boxes of bones from contexts associated with the Spanish occupation of the mission. So looking at the Spanish diet to compare and understand the differences between what they were eating. So while the fragmentation in the context from the Rancheria features was pretty considerable, and it was quite difficult to identify any large mammal. There was no sheep, goat, or donkey remains identified. However, a number of those have been identified in the context from the Spanish quarters. So interesting difference between the two.
Awesome. Julie from Near La Purísima Mission asks, did you try to analyze the use of corn and or other grains?
So probably the only big drawback, at least to my eyes, of zooarchaeology is I only look at animal remains. So it is only half the diet, if that. In my lab where I'm working right now, a lot of my other colleagues look at paleoethnobotany. So that's the examination of seeds. So I know that there's been a number of researchers at Mission Santa Clara that have looked at the seed remains and understanding how the plants change through time. And that's such an important component of diet, especially where Native American diet is concerned. I don't know much about that, unfortunately, but there are many, many publications. So if you're interested, I encourage you to look out for that.
Thank you. Julie also asks, what do we know about pre-contact uses of marrow and marrow extraction?
Yeah, so I did a very long deep dive into this. So there's been, of course, so much archaeological work from a number of excellent archaeologists looking at pre-contact diet from the early Holocene, middle Holocene, late Holocene. And notably within those time periods, there are very long, century-long droughts. So throughout the Holocene, there's distinct evidence of the extraction of grease and marrow. So that's a practice that has continued throughout the millennia. However, we do see during these distinct periods of drought, during a time period called the medieval climatic anomalies, this period where everything went terribly, the pulverization of the bones gets much more intensified. So what that means is typically you're going to pulverize and extract the marrow from the really good bones like the femur. You typically don't try to do that with the feet bones because there's not much associated with those. However, so they're extracting grease and marrow from the femur and the nice long bones the entire time. But when things get really bad, they start to extract the grease and marrow from the feet bones. So while we can see this is a cultural, traditional foodway process, we can see the changes in it related to when there are times of food insecurity, and we're not seeing that at all during the mission period.
Great question and great answer. So we have a couple more. John Johnson of the Natural History Museum and UCSB. Were the fish remains marine fish or freshwater fish?
So most of those were freshwater fish. I had one, or I think it was actually 3 shark vertebrae, which is kind of funky. Side note for the bird, I also had a couple, yeah, well, that's a separate, but no, most of them were freshwater fish, but they're these tiny little mudsuckers. So the really interesting thing about Mission Santa Clara excavation for this project was they used tiny archaeological screens. So everything was caught, almost nothing fell through. So you have these tiny little vertebrae from these tiny little mudsuckers that really make up the majority of the fish. There weren't that many marine fish. It was primarily just these tiny little suckers.
Next question is from Donna. Did your research reveal any extinctions of species of the garden animals?
So no extinctions. Honestly, everything was what you would imagine they would have been hunting. It was a lot of squirrel, it's a lot of rabbit. There's no groundhog or skunk. A number of wild waterfowl, so a lot of geese, a lot of ducks. Occasionally you got something funky like a skunk, but it's difficult to say why that was in the collection. So nothing too exciting, not really any evidence of an exotic animal like a parrot or something crazy, and no evidence of overhunting or over extinction. Just a fairly typical diet based off of very typical hunting strategies.
And I think this might be our last question. It's a really good question. It's from Maureen, talking about the impacts on Indigenous people and how you've consulted Indigenous people in your research and how they interpret your results from your research, if that's occurred.
Yes, so I've reached out to a couple of people. So most of my contact has been with the Tamiana. I've reached out to a couple of them. Honestly, a lot of the interest has been in the bird remains, which I find quite interesting. Birds are fascinating because they have so many different uses. They're not just, of course, for the meat. Their feathers were important, the talons were important, the entire bird was used. There's multi-purposes for the birds. So a lot of the interest has been looking at what birds were there, what portions of the birds, what can that tell us about the past. I will say a lot of my findings aren't frankly terribly revolutionary. A lot of excellent archaeological work has been conducted in the mission system in California for decades. So a lot of my work was a little bit confirming what we already knew, showing additional evidence for this persistence of foodways, which we kind of already knew was occurring. So focusing more on the narrow, what was happening at Mission Santa Clara, a lot of the discussions are involving birds and what that tells us. But once again, that's not exactly my area of expertise. I could never speak for how birds relate to the cultural and religious traditions of these people, but that's really where their interest lies at this moment.
Thank you so much. I think that's most of the questions, unless I'm missing one. Let me make sure. No, I think I got them all. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience before we end our presentation?
Well, I guess once again, I did say that it's hard to know exactly what a diet's looked at without understanding the diet of the Spanish. So it'll be really interesting once we have that data as well to understand how different these two foodway traditions actually were. So,
great. So more to come.
Yes.
Maybe we can have you back once we have that data.
Once I've counted all the bone fragments.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate on behalf of the trust and on behalf of our audience. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing the research with us, and hopefully, we'll have you back when down the road. All right. Thank you, everyone. You can find this lecture because I've gotten a few questions if this will be available later, and it will. on our website, sbthp.org/lectures. You can find all of our lectures. And also, if you look at our website, you'll see upcoming Zoom events. And we have a few that we're about to share with the world that are coming in March and April. So we hope that you'll come back for those. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah. Everyone have a good night.
Thank you.